10 signs you're sabotaging yourself through self-abandonment. You keep telling yourself you're fine, that you're just being mature, realistic, responsible. You don't want to make a scene. You don't want to seem needy. So you stay quiet when something hurts. You ignore the voice inside that says, "This doesn't feel right." You keep giving, even when it empties you. And every time you do, something small but important is lost. A sense of connection to yourself. Most people don't see this as self-sabotage, because on the outside, it looks like kindness, loyalty, resilience. But what's really happening is something deeper. You're not just keeping the peace, you're slowly disappearing inside your own life. Not because you're weak, but because, at some point, you learned to survive by leaving yourself behind. You adapted in ways that made sense at the time, silencing discomfort, minimizing needs, downplaying desires, all to stay accepted, loved, or simply safe. That kind of survival strategy doesn't come from nowhere. Maybe you grew up in an environment where emotional expression was seen as weakness. Or maybe you were rewarded for being easygoing, for not asking for much, for making everyone else's life easier. Over time, you internalized a simple but dangerous message, that being connected to yourself was less important than being connected to others, even if that connection required self-sacrifice. But here's the cost. When you keep suppressing your own needs to keep others comfortable, you eventually lose touch with what those needs even are. You stop checking in with yourself because you've learned that your inner signals can't be trusted, or worse, that they'll only get you in trouble. You learn to perform stability while carrying quiet chaos. And the longer this goes on, the more detached you become from your own truth. This video is not about dramatic breakdowns or emotional outbursts. It's about the subtle erosion that happens when you consistently choose to disconnect from yourself in moments when connection is most needed. It's about the 1,000 tiny ways you might be self-sabotaging through self-abandonment, not because you're broken, but because no one ever taught you how to stay. We'll look at 10 clear, concrete signs. Not surface behaviors, but patterns, deeply wired, often invisible, that show up in the way you think, speak, act, and relate to others. And more importantly, we'll explore how these patterns quietly undermine your self-trust, your clarity, your sense of stability. If you've ever felt invisible in your own life, like your needs are always last, your voice always filtered, your presence always diluted, this is not just happening to you. It's happening because of a pattern that was once protective, but is now quietly destructive. And the shift starts here, not with radical change, but with recognition. With the decision to notice when you're about to abandon yourself. And to pause, just long enough to choose something different. This is not a call to become louder or harder. It's an invitation to become more honest with yourself first. You stay quiet to keep the peace. You hold back your reaction, your disappointment, your needs, not because you don't feel them, but because somewhere in you, there's a quiet belief that speaking up could cost you something important. Maybe connection, maybe respect, maybe safety. So you swallow the truth, soften your edges, and tell yourself you're just being reasonable, mature, emotionally intelligent. But what you're really doing is sacrificing authenticity to avoid discomfort. And every time you do, it chips away at something you can't afford to lose, your sense of self. This pattern doesn't usually start in adulthood. It starts when silence becomes a survival strategy. When your environment, family, school, culture, rewards you for being easy, agreeable, non-confrontational. You learn that keeping things smooth is more important than being honest. That approval comes from not making things harder for anyone. And the more this is reinforced, the more you internalize the idea that your truth is disruptive, something to manage or contain rather than express. Over time, this silence becomes automatic. It doesn't feel like a choice. You edit yourself mid-thought. You second-guess whether what you're feeling is even valid. You anticipate reactions, scan faces, weigh consequences. And by the time you've processed all that, the moment to speak up has passed, so you stay quiet. And then you tell yourself the story that helps you live with that silence. It wasn't that important. I didn't want to start anything. I'll bring it up later. But later rarely comes. Because the longer you stay silent, the harder it becomes to speak. And in that silence, resentment quietly grows. Not just toward others, but toward yourself. You start to notice it in subtle ways. Tension that doesn't go away, irritation at small things, a sudden emotional reaction that feels disproportionate. These aren't random outbursts. They're pressure points, signs that something inside you has been dismissed for too long. What's dangerous about this form of self-abandonment is that it looks virtuous from the outside. People might praise you for being so calm, so easygoing, so non-reactive. But inside, you feel the cost. You feel it in the disconnection, in the way you second-guess yourself, in the way your needs become unclear even to you. You've created peace, but it's a peace built on self-erasure. And here's the paradox. The longer you keep the peace on the outside, the more chaos you create on the inside. Because your emotional system wasn't designed to be ignored, it was designed to guide you, to signal when something's wrong, to help you protect yourself. When you silence that system, you don't just avoid conflict, you lose access to your own internal compass. And without that compass, even the most stable situation starts to feel confusing, exhausting, and emotionally unsafe. Speaking up doesn't always mean confrontation. Sometimes it just means being honest enough to acknowledge what you need, first to yourself, then to the people who matter. It's not about being loud. It's about being real. And the longer you go without that, the more invisible you become, not just to others, but to yourself. So if you find yourself holding your breath in conversations, swallowing reactions, editing yourself before you even speak, that's not neutrality. That's a signal, and it deserves your attention. Because you can't build real peace by constantly betraying your own presence in the room. You tell yourself it's not that bad, that you shouldn't be upset, that other people have it worse, so you should be grateful. You reach for logic, for context, for anything that helps you override the discomfort in your body. And maybe you've convinced yourself that this is maturity, that minimizing your pain is a form of resilience. But what you're really doing is denying your experience before it even has a chance to speak. That's not strength. That's a trained instinct, one rooted in emotional neglect, not self-mastery. Minimizing pain doesn't mean the pain goes away. It just goes underground. It gets stored in the body, in the nervous system, in the subtle emotional tensions you carry without even realizing it. You start calling stress your normal state. You dismiss the tightness in your chest as just being tired. You brush off the dull ache of sadness as overthinking. But what you're really doing is gaslighting yourself, gently, unconsciously, out of your own emotional truth. This usually begins in environments where emotions were treated like problems. Maybe you were told to toughen up. Maybe you were praised for being the strong one. Maybe no one had the capacity to meet you where you were emotionally. So you learned to meet yourself with dismissal instead. You learned to survive not by feeling, but by managing feelings, editing them down until they were quiet enough to ignore. And over time, this becomes your emotional default. Something hurts. You rationalize it. You reframe it. You convince yourself it's no big deal. You think you're being self-aware, when really you're just staying one step ahead of vulnerability. But your body knows. It keeps score. And when you've spent enough time minimizing what hurts, the result isn't peace. It's disconnection. You don't just stop feeling pain. You stop feeling everything. That numbness you sometimes feel, the lack of motivation, the dullness, the absence of joy, it's not random. It's the byproduct of emotional systems that were never given room to breathe. And the longer you minimize your internal signals, the less access you have to the parts of you that are designed to guide, protect, and restore you. You don't need permission to acknowledge that something hurts. You don't need to compare your pain to anyone else's to make it legitimate. Pain doesn't exist on a scoreboard. It exists in the body, and your body doesn't care if someone else has it worse. It only cares if you're listening. This is where self-abandonment becomes especially insidious, because when you minimize your pain, you believe you're being fair. You think you're doing the right thing, but what you're really doing is reinforcing the message that your discomfort doesn't matter, that your threshold for pain is the measure of your worth, that unless something is breaking you completely, it's not worth tending to. And that logic will slowly break you, not in dramatic moments, but in quiet, daily erosion. Healing doesn't start with fixing the pain. It starts with letting yourself feel it, not all at once, not in overwhelm, but with permission, with softness, with enough presence to say, what I feel matters. What I notice is real, and I don't need to downplay my reality to be okay. You don't need a crisis to justify self-care. You don't need to hit your breaking point before you decide to listen. You can begin right where you are by choosing to stop dismissing what your body already knows to be true. You don't say anything, but you wish someone would notice. You hold it together on the outside, calm, composed, available, while inside, you're hoping someone will ask, "Are you really okay?" You keep showing up, doing what's expected, giving what you can. But behind the mask, there's a quiet ache, a longing to be seen without having to explain. You wait for someone to pick up on the unspoken signs. And when they don't, it confirms a belief you already fear, that your pain is invisible, or worse, irrelevant. This isn't about manipulation or attention-seeking. It's about adaptation. When you've learned, through experience or silence, that expressing your needs leads to rejection, punishment, or dismissal, you eventually stop expressing them. You start hoping others will notice the cracks in your voice, the flatness in your eyes, the change in your energy. But this kind of emotional outsourcing doesn't bring connection. It brings more abandonment. Because no matter how close someone is to you, they can't respond to what they've never been told. Over time, this pattern becomes internalized. You start to believe that your needs don't deserve direct expression, that if someone really cared, they would just know. And if they don't know, maybe you're not worth caring for. This is how self-abandonment turns inward, how it morphs from something circumstantial to something that shapes your self-worth. You begin to see your emotional needs as excessive, even when they're completely reasonable. And here's where it gets even more complicated. Part of you wants to speak. You want to say what you need. You want to ask for support. But there's a block, a friction, because you've equated emotional honesty with risk. And not just the risk of rejection, but the risk of feeling too exposed, too vulnerable, too dependent. So you wait. You drop hints. You test the waters. And when nothing happens, you retreat even further. This is the emotional loop. Silence creates invisibility. Invisibility breeds resentment. Resentment reinforces the silence. And with each cycle, you feel less seen. Not because no one cares, but because no one has been given the full chance to witness who you are and what you need. And still, it feels easier to wait than to ask, because asking feels like admitting weakness, like surrendering control. But here's what's actually true. Asking for what you need is not weakness. It's clarity. It's agency. It's the refusal to keep handing your well-being over to guesswork and hope. You don't need someone to read your mind. You need to rebuild the relationship you've avoided the most, the one where you recognize what's going on inside yourself and give it the respect of direct communication. Because if your needs stay locked behind silence, they don't just go unmet. They quietly convince you that you're not worth meeting in the first place. Self-abandonment thrives in that silence. It thrives in the stories we tell ourselves to justify our invisibility. They're too busy. I don't want to burden them. It's not the right time. But there's never a perfect time to be real. There's only the moment you decide that emotional honesty matters more than emotional safety. And that's when something shifts, not just in your relationships, but in the way you see yourself. You don't have to wait to be rescued. You don't need someone to decode your pain. You need one quiet, courageous moment of truth, the kind that says, "This is what I feel. This is what I need." And it matters. You do more than your share, not because you have extra capacity, but because you feel like you have no choice. You take on the responsibility, absorb the tension, clean up the messes, smooth out the edges. Not because it feels good, but because some part of you feels responsible for holding everything together. You become the one people rely on, the one who doesn't break down, the one who always knows what to do. And at first, this identity feels strong, useful, even admirable. But over time, it becomes a trap. Because when your worth is tied to how much you carry, you start forgetting what you're allowed to put down. This is one of the most deceptive forms of self-abandonment. It doesn't look like neglect. It looks like competence. People applaud your reliability. They thank you for being there, for handling it, for showing up again and again without complaint. But what they don't see is what it costs you. The sleep you lose, the needs you suppress, the resentment that builds silently in the background. You don't just overfunction. You overextend your identity to fit what others expect, until there's barely any room left for who you actually are. And this pattern isn't random, it's learned. It often starts early, in households or systems where emotional stability depended on you. Maybe you had to grow up too fast. Maybe you were praised for being so responsible before you even had the chance to figure out what you needed for yourself. So you became the caretaker, the fixer, the buffer, roles that gave you purpose, but also taught you to ignore your own limits. Overfunctioning isn't just a habit. It becomes a lens through which you see the world. You don't ask, "What's mine to carry?" You ask, "What will fall apart if I don't step in?" And from there, everything becomes yours. Everyone's pain, everyone's expectations, everyone's comfort. Meanwhile, your own discomfort becomes irrelevant. You're so used to minimizing your needs that they start to feel like a burden, even to you. The danger of this isn't just burnout. It's emotional invisibility. You start losing access to your own preferences, your own pace, your own internal signals. Not because they aren't there, but because you've trained yourself to override them, to keep moving, to keep managing, until the only version of you that exists is the one who's useful to others. And when someone finally asks how you're doing, you pause, not because you don't want to answer, but because you're not sure. You've been so externally focused, so task-oriented, so responsible, that checking in with yourself feels foreign, even threatening. Because if you really stop to feel what's going on underneath the performance of strength, you might fall apart. And the question you fear most is, if I'm not the one who holds it all together, then who am I? That fear is valid. Letting go of overfunctioning means facing the vulnerability that's been buried underneath your competence. But it also means reclaiming your presence. Because your value isn't in how much you endure. It's in how honestly you live. And that kind of honesty requires room to rest, to say no, to be held instead of always holding. You're allowed to exist outside of being useful. You're allowed to ask for support without proving how strong you are first. You're allowed to stop performing resilience and start living with balance. Not for anyone else, but for the part of you that's tired of carrying what was never yours to begin with. You don't feel angry. You just feel tired, disconnected, unmotivated. You assume it's stress, maybe burnout, maybe just a phase. But beneath that flatness is something more precise and more revealing. You're not simply exhausted. You're emotionally shut down. And in many cases, what you've labeled as apathy or fatigue is actually anger. Anger that's been suppressed for so long, it doesn't even register as emotion anymore. It registers as silence, blankness, numbness. This is a nervous system adaptation. When your environment doesn't allow anger to be expressed, or even felt safely, your body finds a workaround. It turns the volume down on everything. You disconnect from what's overwhelming to preserve stability. At first, it works. You become less reactive, more contained, more in control. But control without emotional contact isn't peace. It's a freeze response. A subtle internal paralysis that disconnects you not just from pain, but from joy, desire, passion, and purpose. Anger is one of the most misunderstood emotions. Most people associate it with danger, conflict, or aggression. But at its core, anger is an internal alarm, a signal that something you care about is being violated. A boundary, a value, a need. When you suppress it, you're not just avoiding confrontation. You're cutting off your connection to what matters most to you. You're silencing the part of you that says, "This isn't okay." And that silence slowly becomes your default emotional state. This is how self-abandonment hides in so-called calm. You tell yourself you're doing fine because you're not reacting. But non-reactivity can be deceptive. When you no longer feel moved by anything, not frustrated, not excited, not even annoyed, what you're experiencing isn't peace, it's detachment. A numbness that once served you, but now prevents you from fully participating in your own life. And the consequences are deeper than most people realize. Emotional numbness affects your relationships. You become harder to reach, harder to read, harder to connect with. It affects your goals. You lose clarity on what you want, not because your desires disappeared, but because you've trained yourself not to want anything too strongly. And it affects your sense of identity. When you disconnect from what energizes or frustrates you, you lose sight of what makes you you. But here's the good news. Numbness isn't the end of the story. It's a message. A signal that your system has been running in survival mode for too long. And what it needs isn't more pressure, it needs permission. Permission to feel, to acknowledge what's been buried, to explore anger not as a problem, but as information. A clue, a map back to the part of you that still cares, even if it's been silent for years. Reconnecting with anger doesn't mean becoming reactive or explosive. It means recognizing what your body has been trying to tell you in every sigh, every shutdown, every blank stare that lasts a little too long. It means asking, what have I been tolerating? What part of me has been silenced in the name of stability? You don't have to force yourself to feel everything at once. That's not healing, that's overwhelm. But you can begin by noticing the edges of your numbness, the small irritations, the tiny disappointments, the moments where your body tenses before your mind catches up. Those are openings. That's where reconnection begins. Because the goal isn't to go from numb to ecstatic. It's to go from numb to honest. And in that honesty, your emotional system can begin to thaw. Not through pressure, but through permission. You promise yourself you'll do better. That you'll start the new routine. That you'll finally set the boundary, take the rest, follow through on what you keep postponing. And for a moment, it feels real. You mean it, you're committed. But then it slips. You skip the routine. You say yes when you meant no. You put yourself last again and justify it. You tell yourself it's not a big deal. But deep down, something hurts, because it wasn't just a task you skipped. It was you abandoned. Most people think this is a discipline problem. They assume inconsistency comes from laziness or lack of willpower. But in truth, it often comes from a deeper emotional fracture, a belief that your needs don't carry weight, that your intentions can be postponed indefinitely, that your desires are optional unless someone else needs something from you. And when that belief sits at the core, every commitment to yourself becomes negotiable. Not because you don't care, but because you've never been taught that you matter first. When you break promises to yourself, the world doesn't fall apart. No one holds you accountable. You can keep going, unnoticed. That's what makes it so easy and so damaging. Because over time, you start internalizing the message, I'm not someone I can count on. And that self-perception erodes more than your habits. It erodes your self-trust. It creates an internal split between the part of you that wants change and the part of you that doesn't believe it's possible. This is how self-abandonment becomes behavioral. Not just emotional, not just cognitive, but habitual. You create patterns that reinforce the belief that your voice doesn't matter, even when that voice is your own. You overcommit, underrest, break goals, and call it normal. You convince yourself you're just bad at follow-through, without questioning the deeper reason why you keep letting yourself down. And here's where it gets even more painful. Every time you do it, you feel it. The disappointment, the shame, the quiet grief of being overlooked again. Not by others this time, but by the one person who was supposed to show up, you. And that grief doesn't just sit still. It leaks into your motivation, your self-esteem, your relationships. You start to expect inconsistency not just from yourself, but from life. But this isn't about being perfect. It's not about never missing a day, never breaking a rule, never slipping up. It's about repairing the rupture, not through pressure, but through presence. You don't need more willpower. You need more honesty, more clarity, more self-respect disguised as structure. Because every time you say, "I'll do this," and follow through, you teach your nervous system that your needs are real, that your voice is safe, that you're not going to disappear again. Start small. One promise, one practice. Not because it makes you impressive, but because it makes you whole. Not because someone else will notice, but because you will. That's how self-reconnection begins. Not with radical transformation, but with quiet evidence. I said I would. And I did. That's where trust is rebuilt. That's where abandonment ends. You finally do something for yourself. Something small. Something honest. You cancel the plan. You say no. You leave the conversation that was draining you. And almost instantly, the guilt rises. It's sharp, heavy, irrational. You start second-guessing the choice, replaying the interaction, wondering if you were too harsh, too selfish, too much. The discomfort doesn't match the action. But it feels real. It feels familiar. And that's the clue. What you're feeling isn't a response to wrongdoing. It's a conditioned response to self-prioritization. This kind of guilt doesn't come from your present logic. It comes from your past wiring, from the systems and dynamics, family, culture, community, that taught you your worth was tied to how much you could accommodate others. That love meant sacrifice. That goodness meant availability. That being a good person meant always making space for everyone but yourself. So when you start to shift, even gently, that guilt shows up not as a mistake, but as a signal that you've stepped outside the role you were trained to play. And that's the trap. The more you internalize those rules, the more distorted your sense of fairness becomes. You can sense when someone else is overextended, and you immediately offer compassion. But when you need space, rest, or boundaries, your instinct is self-doubt. You ask yourself, who am I to take up space? Who am I to say no? What if this hurts someone? Your guilt speaks louder than your clarity. This is not because you're weak. It's because you learned over time that your needs were a potential threat to relationships, to stability, to peace. And so, to keep things safe, you abandoned yourself. And every time you try to return, guilt tries to pull you back. Not because it's right, but because it's familiar. The hardest part of this pattern is that the guilt feels like truth. It sounds like conscience, like integrity, like morality. But guilt isn't always a moral compass. Sometimes it's just a memory, a residue from a version of you who survived by staying small, quiet, and accommodating. So how do you break it? Not by waiting for the guilt to disappear. It won't, not at first. The key is to act alongside it. To let the guilt rise and still honor your boundary. To feel the discomfort and still choose yourself. Not because it's comfortable, but because it's correct. This is emotional reconditioning. It's the moment you realize that guilt is not a reliable guide in this part of your healing. In fact, it may be the very thing standing between you and your own self-respect. You can feel guilt and still make the right choice. You can feel discomfort and still be in alignment. And the more you do this, the more you normalize the experience of choosing yourself without collapse, the quieter the guilt becomes. It doesn't vanish overnight, but it loses its power. Because guilt, in this context, is not proof that you're doing harm. It's proof that you're doing something different. Something your system isn't used to. Something that, deep down, is leading you back to clarity. Choosing yourself isn't betrayal. It's repair. And yes, at first, it will feel unnatural. That's what happens when you've been conditioned to disappear. But every time you stay present, despite the guilt, you reclaim a part of yourself that was never supposed to be given away. You're asked what you want, and your mind goes blank. Not because you're trying to be polite, not because you're indecisive, but because the question feels foreign. It doesn't land. It hangs in the air like something meant for someone else. You pause, search your brain for a clear answer, and come up empty. So instead, you default to what's expected, to what's safe, to what won't disrupt anything. But in that moment, a deeper truth surfaces. You're not out of options. You're out of access to yourself. This is what happens when self-abandonment becomes chronic. You don't just lose touch with what you want. You lose the reflex to even check in. You stop consulting your own inner world because somewhere along the way, you learned it didn't count. You learned to prioritize harmony, responsibility, image, logic, everything except your internal truth. And the longer you live like that, the harder it becomes to locate yourself when it actually matters. It starts subtly. Maybe you adapted to someone else's rhythm, in a relationship, in a household, in a team. You became flexible, agreeable, easy, but under that surface you were slowly muting your preferences. Not because you didn't have any, but because they seemed inconvenient. You learned to scan the room before scanning yourself. And you got so good at attuning to others that you lost the habit, and eventually the skill, of attuning inward. What's important to understand is that this disconnection is not a flaw in your personality. It's a product of your emotional history. You were shaped by environments that rewarded you for being low maintenance and punished you, overtly or subtly, for expressing inconvenient desires. So over time, you replace desire with calculation. You learn to ask, what's the smart choice? The acceptable choice? The least disruptive choice? And those questions buried the one you actually needed. What's right for me? This is where identity confusion begins. When your life becomes a series of unconscious adaptations, it's easy to wake up in a career, a relationship, or a routine that doesn't feel like yours. Not because you weren't paying attention, but because you were trained to pay attention elsewhere. You weren't taught to listen to your gut. You were taught to survive. And survival doesn't leave much room for preference. But there's something else underneath all this. You do have wants. You do have instincts. You do have clarity. It's just quiet, dormant, buried under years of deferring, adjusting, and avoiding. And no, it won't all rush back at once. But it doesn't need to. Reconnection isn't about making perfect decisions. It's about making contact. It's about asking the question, even when the answer is unclear. What do I want right now? What would feel more honest? What part of me have I been ignoring? At first, you might not know. That's okay. Not knowing isn't a failure. It's a sign that you're rebuilding something that was never supposed to be dismantled. Your inner orientation. Your emotional reference point. Your relationship with agency. You don't need total clarity to start. You just need permission. Permission to pause before you answer. To feel into the choice. To not rush to fill the silence with what sounds right. Because when you slow down, even just for a moment, something small but real begins to re-emerge. The quiet voice of self-direction. The part of you that does know, and has been waiting for you to stop outsourcing your life. You stay in places that drain you, in relationships that exhaust you, in jobs that deaden you, in routines that leave you numb. Not because they fulfill you, but because they're familiar. You convince yourself it's manageable, that things could be worse, that you should be grateful. You tell yourself you're just being realistic, that discomfort is a part of life. But somewhere deeper, there's a quiet truth you don't want to admit. You've confused endurance with self-respect. You've learned to cope, to manage, to push through, and you're good at it. Maybe too good. You tolerate emotional neglect, disconnection, chronic stress, not because you want to, but because you've trained yourself to survive what doesn't serve you. You've developed a remarkable capacity to stay, to adapt, to downplay the emotional cost of staying. And that capacity, while it may have helped you survive in the past, now keeps you stuck. This pattern isn't just circumstantial, it's emotional. It's built on a core belief that your comfort can wait, that your intuition isn't reliable, that asking for more is selfish, ungrateful, or unrealistic, so you settle. You stay in rooms that slowly empty you. You convince yourself that not bad is good enough, that predictable misery is better than uncertain change. And over time, this logic distorts your internal compass. You stop asking, "What do I need?" and start asking, "What can I tolerate?" And when tolerable becomes your standard for life, your identity begins to shrink. You stop imagining more. You stop trusting your discomfort as a guide. You start feeling like a visitor in your own life, present, but disengaged. This is where self-abandonment hides in plain sight. You're not falling apart. You're functioning, showing up, smiling when it's appropriate, saying the right things. But inside, you're disappearing, slowly, quietly, systematically, not because you don't care, but because you've built a life around not being a burden. Maybe you've told yourself that leaving would be too disruptive, that it would hurt someone, that it's not the right time. Maybe you're waiting for proof that things are bad enough to justify change. But that's the trap, believing you need to be at a breaking point before you're allowed to choose something better. You don't need to hit rock bottom to leave what's misaligned. You don't need a crisis to honor a boundary. Exhaustion is enough. Confusion is enough. The quiet realization that you've been living someone else's definition of good is enough. This isn't about quitting everything and burning your life down. It's about refusing to stay in environments that require you to abandon your clarity, your needs, your dignity, just to keep the structure intact. You don't need to prove that it's unbearable. You only need to notice that it no longer feels like you. Endurance can be noble, but endurance without direction is just prolonged misalignment. It teaches you to silence the parts of you that are trying to leave. And the longer you stay, the more those parts stop trying. So ask yourself, not just, can I survive this? But do I choose this? Because if the answer is no, then staying is not strength. It's self-neglect with a polished exterior. You know something's not working. You feel the restlessness, the tension, the subtle emotional friction that comes with knowing a change is needed. You think about speaking up, walking away, setting the boundary, finally choosing yourself. But you don't move. Not yet. You wait for the right moment, for the right feeling, for confirmation. You tell yourself you're not ready, and maybe that's true. But what's also true is harder to admit. You're waiting for permission. This kind of waiting doesn't look dramatic. It looks rational, thoughtful, controlled. But under the surface, it's a quiet form of avoidance. Because the moment you act, everything shifts. Expectations change. Relationships get disrupted. The version of you that others depend on might have to disappear. And so you hesitate, not because you don't know what to do, but because doing it means stepping outside the role that's kept you safe, useful, predictable. That hesitation often gets misinterpreted as self-doubt, but it's deeper than doubt. It's fear, not of failure, but of disconnection, of disrupting the balance you've worked so hard to maintain. You wait because you're afraid that choosing yourself might lead to rejection, that prioritizing your needs might make you unlovable, that changing direction might mean disappointing the people who are used to your compliance. So you stay still, not out of peace, but out of internal conflict. And while you wait, the emotional cost builds. Your confidence dulls. Your instincts get quieter. The gap between what you feel and how you live stretches wider. You start to mistrust yourself, not because you're wrong, but because you keep overriding what you know. You start living in mental rehearsals, scripting conversations you never have, visualizing exits you never take, clinging to clarity that never becomes action. This is how self-abandonment wears its final disguise as patience, as emotional maturity, as I just need more time. But time doesn't make a decision for you. Time passes whether you act or not. And the longer you wait for the outside world to align with your internal truth, the more you teach yourself that your truth doesn't matter until someone else validates it. You don't need permission to return to yourself. You don't need a perfect plan. You don't need the absence of fear. You only need presence. Enough presence to recognize when your waiting has become a delay tactic. When your silence is no longer thoughtful, it's protective. When your stillness isn't grounded, it's frozen. There will never be a perfect moment to start showing up, to name the thing, to change direction, to be honest. There will only ever be this one, the moment you decide that your clarity is reason enough, that your discomfort is data, that your desire for alignment is not excessive or dramatic, it's real. And real is enough. You're not behind, you're not broken. You're not weak for hesitating. You're just done living on standby. And when you realize that the life you want isn't waiting for you, it's waiting on you, the dynamic shifts. You stop looking outward for green lights, and you become the one who says, go. Self-abandonment doesn't announce itself. It doesn't break things suddenly or loudly. It works in silence, in the way you edit your words mid-sentence, in the way you tense before saying no, in the way you apologize for things that don't require an apology. It hides inside the roles you've learned to play, the peacekeeper, the helper, the strong one, the one who never needs anything. And because those roles look functional, even admirable, you may not realize they're slowly eroding the core of who you are. That's what makes self-abandonment so difficult to detect. You're still moving, still contributing, still showing up. But somewhere beneath the routines and responsibilities, something essential is missing. Your full, honest presence. Not the version of you that keeps things running, the version of you that feels, that chooses, that says, this is what I need, even if it's inconvenient. What makes this pattern especially painful is that it's often rewarded. You're praised for being easygoing, for not asking too much, for being so selfless. But that praise can become a trap, reinforcing the idea that disappearing a little bit every day is what makes you worthy of love, inclusion, or respect. And over time, that praise gets internalized. You stop even noticing how far you've drifted from yourself. But eventually, something breaks through. A moment of emotional friction. A relationship that feels one-sided. A morning where you wake up and think, whose life am I living? And that moment, while disorienting, is sacred. Because it marks the beginning of return. Self-reconnection isn't a performance. It doesn't require grand declarations or perfect boundaries. It begins in small, steady acts of honesty. Choosing to notice when you feel off instead of brushing past it. Choosing to ask yourself what you want, even if you don't know the answer. Choosing to pause, to check in, to stay even briefly with yourself. The most radical form of healing isn't becoming someone new. It's becoming someone present. The kind of presence that doesn't collapse under guilt. That doesn't disappear to preserve the comfort of others. That doesn't confuse endurance with worth. You are not behind for only noticing this now. You are not selfish for wanting something different. You are not fragile for feeling this deeply. You are simply human, and finally ready to come back to the parts of you that were left behind in all the pleasing, performing, and protecting. And yes, it will feel unfamiliar at first. Choosing yourself always does when you've been taught not to. But unfamiliar doesn't mean wrong. It means new. And the discomfort you feel is not a sign to stop. It's a sign that you're alive. Again, listening, choosing, reclaiming. You don't need to burn everything down. You don't need to fix every pattern overnight. You just need to notice the next moment where you could leave yourself and choose not to. That's what this is. Not a transformation, but a return. Not a reinvention, but a remembering. Back to the version of you that never needed to be anyone else. Just someone who stayed.